This week, we're talking about a subject which is very close to my heart, and that is welfare. And we're going to clear up a few things about the Victorian workhouse. When you think of the workhouse, you're almost immediately drawn to the works of Dickens and the vision of destitution that's in each and every one of his books. But Dickens is creating a narrative around his own opinions of the workhouse. And what he did was he combined elements seen in a wide range of earlier workhouses to create the ultimate dank and desperate setting. Using Dickens to learn what workhouses are like is like using Shakespeare to get a handle on Richard III. They're writing fictions, albeit they're writing fictions with undeniably vivid narratives, and it's very easy to forget that, but they are fictions all the same. So with that in mind, we've come today to settle 4 big myths about the Victorian workhouse. Myth number 1, they're not prisons. We have this idea that a person or a whole family is sentenced to a workhouse, and then once in the workhouse, that's where they must stay. And this is simply not the case. Entering the workhouse is entirely voluntary. Well, it is for adults at least. It's true that your circumstances might feel that you have no other choice, and it may be your only alternative to homelessness or destitution, but it is still voluntary. There isn't some overbearing beadle or parish guardian who determines that you're not wealthy enough or productive enough and sentences you to live out your days in the workhouse. That's just wrong. In fact, as well as it being entirely your own choice as to whether or not you go into a workhouse as well, it actually takes some effort to get admitted. You can't just walk up the door and knock. If you were applying for parish relief, then you would first apply via your parish poor law guardians. Then you would be visited by a relieving officer who would judge the sort of relief that would be appropriate. If you were able-bodied and capable of work, then you'd likely be offered admission to the workhouse. You'd be given the appropriate documentation to show that you had permission to enter the workhouse, and you'd go off and report for admission. If you're not able to work, then you may be offered parish money or outdoor poor relief. You still retain the right to decline these though, and there might not be anything else offered as an alternative if you did so, but again, welfare and workhouses were voluntary. You could refuse. And just as it's your decision to go into the workhouse, it is also entirely your decision as to if you leave. Most workhouse stays were totally temporary. You gave a few hours notice of your intention to leave and then you were off. Again, there wasn't any kind of like grants or assistance going outside, so transitioning to the outside actually could be quite difficult, but they weren't going to force you to stay. Now, a minor exception to this were the casual wards, which offered a little more than a roof over their head. They required inmates to stay until at least 9 a.m. after one full day of admission and work, but this was really to stop them becoming just a free lodging house. Again, workhouses are not prisons. So, Victorian workhouse myth number 2, they're just not Victorian. We think of the workhouse as a quintessentially Victorian institution, and it's true that the Victorian era was their golden age, or possibly when they are the bleakest of houses. But the workhouse institution massively predates this time. The seeds of the workhouse appear as early as the 14th century, when the 1388 Statute of Cambridge placed restrictions on the movement of labour as a response to labour shortages in the aftermath of the Black Death. Since the poor could not leave the area to find work, this is the first time the state has to become involved in the lives of the poor. At this time, a great proportion of that sort of work fell on the church. But then Henry VIII was going to come along and see fit to end a lot of that. But the birth of the workhouse as we know them really comes from as early as the end of Elizabeth I's reign, when the 1601 Act for the Relief of the Poor made parishes responsible for the care of the poor in their district, and the able-bodied poor were offered work in houses of correction. That'll be a time when workhouses were prisons. 1631 is the earliest reference we have, and that's when the Mayor of Abingdon wrote, "We have erected within our borough a workhouse to set poor people to work." So far from being a Victorian thing, they've actually been with us since late Tudor times. Now, myth number 3, the food was not as bad as you think. When we think of food at a workhouse, we're pretty much straight back into the idea of gruel 3 times a day and an onion twice a week, which is the menu laid out in Oliver Twist. And again, we need to stop thinking Dickens and start thinking history. The food might have been basic, but in many cases it was more nutritious than the average workhouse inmate had before they went in there. It could even be better than some meals had by people who had jobs. And before we dismiss gruel, let's actually examine it. It's not a torture food, it is basically thin porridge with treacle. It's a touch bland because you're using water rather than milk, but it's okay for a cheap breakfast. We'll put you the recipe in the description if you want to make it yourself. It's rather interesting to note that if you follow the instructions on the side of Scott's porridge oats, you're getting basically the same recipe, but the addition of treacle today is seen as a tasty tip, when it was a staple part of the gruel recipe. Plus, you would only be having that maximum once a day. It was part of breakfast, it wasn't part of the mainstay of your diet. Now, the rest of the menu features midday meals of things like suet pudding, rice pudding, soup. There were meat and vegetables 3 times a week, and usually a fish dinner 1 day per week as well. The sort of diet that Dickens portrays in his workhouses, the 3 bowls of gruel and half an onion, just wouldn't sustain a working person. Dickens's menu comes to 825 calories per day. Bear in mind that the current recommended calorie intake to maintain health is 2,500 per man and 2,000 per woman. 825 is just unsustainable and dangerous. Myth number 4. The treatment and health was not as shocking as you think. Now, while it's true that earlier workhouse healthcare was the domain of female inmates who were, in many cases, drunk, illiterate, elderly, or combination of the 3, that was very much a Georgian phenomenon. The Victorians made huge advances in cleaning up the health of the workhouse population. The 1870s saw new workhouse infirmaries being built, which, thanks in no small part to the constant campaigning of Florence Nightingale, employed trained nurses. Access to medical care was available through poor law doctors in a way that just wasn't outside the workhouses. Outside, this medical care had to be paid for, and therefore a low-income family, such as a family of costermongers or general labourers, might struggle to get the basic medical care that the workhouse inmate gets for free. And facilities for their time were state-of-the-art. You'll find that many of our hospitals were former workhouses. This is certainly the case where we live. Here is St James's in Leeds, Dewsbury General Hospital, Stoke Royal, and Northallerton General. They're all former workhouses whose medical role stayed on when the workhouse closed. Many workhouse inmates were here for that very reason, particularly the elderly, as their end-of-life care often couldn't be maintained by their family, and so they would enter the workhouse for their latter days. On death, you get a parish funeral. The idea that you are dumped in unhallowed ground is a complete myth. The workhouse grave in Beckett Street Cemetery shows what are known as guinea graves, the workhouse dead. Sure, they may be communal, but they are marked. They are blessed. In conclusion, the workhouse was never going to be fun. It wasn't supposed to be fun. There's plenty wrong with workhouse schemes. I don't feel, for example, that they serve the purpose that Victorian society wanted, which was the improvement of the poor. The people in the workhouse were not picking up skills, they were not making employment contacts, and they were not able to look for work independently without leaving the workhouse. In short, their best way out of poverty was closed off to them. And the sad thing is, it took until the late 1940s for us to truly see the back of workhouses. But it is important not to look at them as something that they were not, because that way we don't learn anything. Now, many of our former workhouses are still standing. Ripon, for example, has turned theirs into a workhouse museum. And if you want to check out your local one, then I'd recommend visiting workhouses.org, which is an incredibly thorough look at the history of workhouses and what happened to the ones in each parish. I'll leave you with the one local to me in Yorkshire, Pontefract Union Workhouse. The building still stands and it has now been refurbished into flats. In 1871, you could live here when you had absolutely nothing. 150 years later, living here will cost you £65,000 for a flat. How times change. Bye-bye.